Welcome to Cracking Cancer, where we tackle the tough questions about cancer with real patients and world experts. Our mission is to empower the cancer community through education, bring transparency to the oncology system, and drive funding for critical cancer research. Whether you're facing a diagnosis, supporting a loved one, or simply here to learn, we're here to bring clarity, hope, and action to the fight against cancer. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cracking Cancer, the podcast dedicated to answering your cancer-related questions and raising money for cancer research. You can subscribe, and visit crackingcancer.org to support us and learn more. I'm your host, Dr. Kannon. I am a medical oncologist and physician scientist at MD Anderson. And with me is Samantha Morell.
Hi everyone, Samantha Morell. I have non-small cell lung cancer with a HER2 mutation. It is stage 4, and I'm a patient advocate. Great to be here.
All right, and today we're talking about the first oncology visit, which is something I really look forward to talking about. I think it's one of the more exciting parts of any of my clinical days is going in and meeting someone new and getting that plan in motion, answering questions, and starting that therapeutic alliance, that relationship that'll last over a long time. So it's a really important day for a lot of people, for the patient, the oncologist alike, something we really look forward to. And we're going to be going over why it's important, expectations, things you should bring, expectations for the oncologist, and then, some takeaways that might make that process a little less intimidating and as fruitful and productive as it can be. To kick us off, I'd like to first start with you, Samantha. When you were first diagnosed, I'm curious your thoughts before going into your first oncology visit. What were your anxieties? What were you feeling?
So I was diagnosed initially in an emergency room. And so I was told I was being referred to an oncologist. I lived in a smaller town at the time, population 70,000 people. And so my wait for my oncology appointment was actually 2 weeks, which felt like an absolute lifetime. But within that 2-week period, I was able to do lots of research and gained a lot of understanding about what I was dealing with and a lot of the questions I wanted to ask. And so I wrote down a lot of the questions. And so when I went into that initial appointment, I felt like I was ready to go. I felt like I had the right questions to ask. I was not scared or anything about the appointment because I've been waiting 2 weeks. I was like, let's just get this done. I want to get this cancer under control as soon as possible. So let's just get this done and let's have this appointment. So it was more, I don't know if excitement is the right word, but just okay, this appointment is finally here. Thank goodness. Let's get it done. I have these questions to ask. And I made sure that my husband came with me because I knew that for half of the appointment, I'd probably be in shock. And I very much needed him to be the listener and be able to give me information after the fact, because I wasn't going to be digesting a lot of the information the doctor was saying. And
during that 2 weeks, it's an excruciating waiting time for people. We appreciate. What were some of the things you were hoping to accomplish? What were you waiting for most from that first visit?
So specifically because I had lung cancer and I was only 37 years old upon diagnosis, I read a lot about genetic mutations, different mutations that could appear. And so I was reading a lot about biomarker testing and what that meant, and that you needed to get that done essentially to figure out if you had a mutation, which was pretty common when you're a younger patient. While not everyone has one, a lot of people do. And I was concerned that my oncologist, not knowing him at all, might not know about biomarker testing because he wasn't a thoracic expert. He was a general oncologist. So the very, very top question, and the one I had to get covered, was I need to have biomarker testing. And so that was my top question, because I didn't want to be treated wrong. And so that was definitely my top question. I think the other questions were more around just like, where am I at with this? Like, is this really far along stage 4? Is this, did we catch this earlier in stage 4? Like, where are we at here? And like, I feel okay. So like, what is that all about? And can we talk through why I feel okay at stage 4? And that was a lot of confusion for me. Because I always thought stage 4 meant you were like actively dying. And that's not necessarily the case. I've come to find out. So a lot of my questions were based around, biomarkers, where I'm at in the stage 4 process. I did have on my list, like, how long do you think I might have? And just more intrinsic information about like, what is the status of my liver, because I had liver metastasis, like how's my liver doing, like just getting in the weeds a little bit more around my scans, because obviously you have those write-ups that are very clinical and scientific, and getting more of a layman's term perspective of like where you're really at is what I wanted to know.
Yeah. And I think you're probably one of the more involved or educated patients around your care that, on the spectrum of folks that we see. So if you're someone listening at home and you don't know all that information about your cancer, that's certainly okay too. So you came in with, here are some questions and a list of demands.
Yes.
And that's good. Like, you want to be involved in your care. And as far as I'm concerned, from the medical oncology perspective, when someone comes in and has a good sense of, what they need, that's really helpful, because on one hand, the patient has a set of expectations for the oncologist, and it's nice for me as the oncologist to know what your expectations of me are, because, part of this is, a big part of it is the clinical stuff, like what is the cancer, how do we treat the cancer, but a lot of it also is interpersonal. And I want to make sure that I'm meeting your goals, because that's a really big part of delivering therapy. We're a team, and I want to be there to fulfill this service of meeting your goals. And if those are not clear, then it sets up room for disappointment and, really poor relationships, and that can lead to poor outcomes and mistrust. So I think coming in there and saying, hey, I know I have a lung cancer. Everything I'm reading says I need to get this molecular analysis done. And for other people, it'll be different for whatever cancer they may have. I've heard this marker is important. Definitely helps, I would say, to come in and say, I read this right off the bat. Is this something we can look into? Those things always help more than hurt. Mm-hmm. So, I'm hearing the expectations for the oncologist side. And I think, a lot of people come in wanting a certain level of clarity of, when people come to me, it's, do I have what they say I have? Is this pathologic diagnosis correct? Do I really have cancer? And then, there's usually a list of other questions, like, as you mentioned, some people want to know what stage is it? And, what are roughly the treatments for that stage? What can I expect in terms of survival outcomes? Now, the survival outcome question is not something we get into every first visit, but for people who are interested and they're ready to hear that, I always offer it. But, for folks listening, don't feel obligated to get into that level of detail, because this is just the beginning of a long-term relationship. But before we get into maybe some of the other conversational elements, as you were preparing, Samantha, what were some of the things that you wanted to make sure you brought with you? Because you were saying, you brought support system, because a lot of this stuff, for many people, there's just so much information. It's really hard to capture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I made sure my husband came along, because I wanted him to take on board everything the oncologist said. I often interpret things when I'm very stressed out in a completely different way of what the oncologist or doctor is saying. So I needed someone to be there with me, whether that be your spouse, a friend, anyone. I just recommend someone go along with you to be that support system, but also be to digest what the person is telling you. And then also I took a notebook and notepad with me that listed all the questions I had for the doctor, but also to take note of information that they might be telling me that I wanted to note down and make sure I didn't forget. I didn't record the conversation, but that could also be something that you could do if you got their permission, so you can listen back or maybe share with other family members that you want them to hear that entire conversation happen. But yeah, I just made sure I had my notebook, my questions, and my husband. That was
Pretty good checklist.
that was what prepared me the most to go into that appointment.
Yeah, and I'll say for people who visit me, and if they have someone that can listen in, it's great if they're there in person. But if they're not able to be there in person, it's pretty common that people will call in. Either it'll be face to face, like a FaceTime or a Zoom, or just on the phone. And that way it feels like there are more people in the room. And sometimes we get like a lot of people doing that. And not only can some record, so they can listen back and get details and ask follow-ups, but it also gives more people, that cognitive processing power to think about what's going on, to understand it and raise questions. That first visit, time is often limited. We'd love to have more time, but I would expect about half an hour. And that does leave a good amount of time for questions, if the records and everything came through. So don't feel shy about taking the oncologist's time, so to speak, in getting your questions answered. Definitely raise them. And if you don't get to them that first visit because time is short, keep that notebook. That notebook is not going anywhere, I promise. There will be more questions, and that's a huge part of that ongoing care, is readdressing and often asking the same question like 10 times. And that's completely okay, because this stuff's really complicated and it makes more sense the more you're in it. So going back and re-asking those first questions is sometimes really important to understand what's going on and help navigate what you should be doing.
I did want to touch on the emotional aspect of that first visit too, in the sense of, I don't think, because I was so set on, okay, I've waited 2 weeks, I want to go in, I've got this list of questions, I felt like I was solid emotionally, I've got a handle of this, I have my questions, etc. Let's just go. When I turned up, because the community hospital was, had a section for oncology, and it was a pretty small waiting room, and, you check in and give your name, etc. That's when it really hit me, oh my goodness, yes, I've read that I have cancer through my medical MyChart app, and yes, I've had a phone call that I have been told I have cancer, but this was the first, and it might not necessarily be the case for everyone, but this was my first in-person visit with a human being that was saying, yes, I officially have cancer, and we're going to talk to you about it. And so I broke down in the waiting room, in a really bad way. And there were a lot of older individuals in the room, waiting. And I was just this young thing and no one else was young. And it was just very jarring, and very emotional, just instantly, without me thinking I was going to have any of that emotion. It was like being told I had cancer all over again. And so just kind of giving the audience a heads up, it's okay to be upset and to almost grieve that this is really happening to you. And that shock of being in the hospital, don't be taken aback in that might also happen to you, because it was a shock to me that it happened, but it did. And it was just more of a state of, oh, I'm really here and this is really a thing. So yeah, that was something I was not prepared for to happen.
Yeah. And I'll say that reaction is incredibly common.
Yes.
It's so common. And whenever I have a new patient visit, or even many of the early visits, even after that first patient visit, I make sure to have tissues there, because I think a lot of people that I see, the really strong hope is that I'm going to come in and tell them they don't have cancer. And it's really hard to know that's what they want to hear and not be able to say it. And it's so hard on them to be holding out hope. And then this last kind of bastion of hope to say you don't have cancer doesn't do that. Yep. So that is a really hard barrier to live through. I can't speak to it, Samantha, like you can, but to feel that way is almost the rule rather than the exception. I would say probably about half have that reaction in the beginning.
Yep.
Does that get better over time?
No. And I laugh because I'm a different circumstance where I go to my hospital regularly for things like acupuncture. So it's like less jarring when I go, because it's like, oh, I'm just going for acupuncture instead of chemotherapy. Whereas I think for other people that are literally just there for their treatments, maybe it's more of like, oh, I'm here again. This is really a thing. And it's just like that reminder, especially if you don't have that many maybe side effects from your treatment, or you're just feeling okay. Generally, it is very jarring, like, oh, I'm here again. And I remember when I was getting my lung drained regularly because it was filling up with fluid, which is a common thing to happen at stage 4 cancer, lung cancer. That experience of getting drained was the most traumatic, honestly, that I've gone through this entire time, because it's like a very physical experience of like, oh, yes, I really do have cancer. I have to have this done. And it's not a pleasant experience. And I actually remember my very first oncology appointment. I was filling up with fluid very quickly, and it was unpleasant, and it was a horrible experience. And the oncologist said to me, I said, I'm really worried about this fluid. It's really an unpleasant experience. Like, this is what's the only thing that's giving me symptoms. And he said, that's the least of your worries. And that statement really stayed with me, because it's like, I'm telling you, like, the worst experience of all of the cancer and how horrible it is. And you're saying that's the least of my worries. That was also like a shock moment of like, oh, this really is bad. Like, this is bad if he's saying that. And, some doctors are just very matter of fact, right? He didn't mean any like ill intent about it, but it was like, this is the least of your worries. It was just like, oh, okay. Which made it even more of a reality of like the situation that I was in, right? So it's also like going back to the patient-doctor relationship, especially in that first visit, how important it is for things to be said right, to be said in a way that gives you, even if it is like the worst appointment of your life because you're realizing what it is, but at least some comfort and empathy and compassion and care that you feel supported and your oncologist is going to be there for you through this journey in a supportive manner.
Yeah. And it sounds like that first interaction, there were maybe some areas for improvement there. And, I've been on the other side of that, where I come off in ways that I, are probably colder than I intended, or, and I think the expectations for me that I have on myself, because now I'm feeling that insecurity. I can't change the outcome for a lot of patients that come through. Like, we can give the best medicines we can give, and we can give our most informed opinions, but they have to walk that path. And I can't change where the path's necessarily going to go. I can't guarantee anything. But the hope is that what is in my control is that they don't have to walk through that alone. And when I hear something like, oh, the fluid around your lung is really symptomatic, they're like, oh, well, that's the least of your concerns. That doesn't, I would hope to give a stronger sentiment of, here's how we make that better, and here's what we can do. Like, because everything is so hard. Everything is so hard. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Cracking Cancer. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, and visit crackingcancer.org for more information. Every dollar we earn goes directly to furthering the podcast and supporting vital cancer research. Because together, we can crack cancer.